Welcome to Smarticus Tells History. All right, enough with the echo and fanfare. You're here for history, right? And not that boring crap you learned in high school. This stuff's actually interesting. Like things you've never heard about the Civil War, Cleopatra, automobiles, Monopoly, the Black Plague, and more. Fascinating stories, interesting topics, and some downright weird facts from the past. It's a new twist on some stories you may know, and an interesting look at some things you may have never heard. So, grab a beer, kick back, and enjoy. Here's your host, Smarticus.
Welcome to this episode of Smarticus Tells History. I am your host, Smarticus, and I have my co-host, Phoenix, joining me.
Hello.
This episode, we will be exploring one of the most infamous events in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. Now, since we're including some kind of food item in our episodes, this week we're doing an original rye bread recipe that would have been used back then. A fun fact about the rye bread is that it may have actually caused the witch trials. In 1976, a woman named Linda Caporeal, something like that. That's a hard name to pronounce.
I think it's corporeal.
It might be Caporeal, yeah. Linda Caporeal was the first to make this possible connection. Again, it's just a theory, but many historians do believe that it is a possibility. She found that the trials happened almost immediately after an outbreak of rye ergot. Ergot is a fungus known to have grown on bread and is a hallucinogen. It could make its victims appear to be behaving strangely or bewitched, when in fact, they were just stoned. It thrives in a cold winter followed by a wet spring. Fun fact number 2 is that the hallucinogens found in rye ergot are literally LSD. Lysergic acid dithylamide is literally extracted from rye fungus. For those that are not aware, in the late 17th century, a series of trials and executions took place in Salem, Massachusetts that resulted in the deaths of 20 people who were accused of witchcraft. Oh, we didn't even talk about the bread. All
right, let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's just talk about it. So, like we said, now she actually used, I think, a different recipe than what I did.
I had to because I'm gluten free. I can't handle.
Right.
They make me sick.
And I'm not entirely sure that. I mean, do you bake? I don't even know do you bake often?
I do.
Sometimes, or okay. So you probably would have done a better job with this than I would. I almost never bake. So, like, I can make muffins, but that's usually just out of like
a mix?
Packaged muffins, the mix, and I just put milk in it, and then I use my mixer,
right?
And I just mix it, and then I just throw it in the oven. That's literally all you do. So, did you get butter for your bread? Out of curiosity,
I put butter on mine. Yes,
mine is still. I baked it for probably 2.5 hours, and it's still moist in the center.
Yeah, it's too dense.
So I think it's just
it's
super heavy. Yeah, mine is super heavy. Well, I showed you. It's 1.1 pound. I mean, that's very heavy for bread. Yeah.
Yes, it's supposed to be smaller. I made little tiny rolls, and honestly, if you were to throw this at someone without it being cut, you'd probably give them a black freaking eye.
Yeah, my bread knife, like, I almost had to take it to my table saw. I mean, it was it was hard.
Gonna cut through this bad boy.
Now it says rye bread is very dense to begin with.
It is, yes.
So I'm not entirely sure if it's supposed to be this dense.
Right.
But like I said, mine didn't rise at all either. So.
Well, yeah, no. Anyways. Mine didn't rise much, that's for bloody sure.
Yeah, I don't think mine rose at all. And I left it sitting out on the counter for almost 3 hours, and it was like nothing happened. So I just threw it in the oven.
Well, like I said, there is a special kind of magic when it comes to bread.
So with this, I found a YouTube channel from the history. It's the History Channel's YouTube channel, and they used these ingredients, and my recipe was, I believe it was 5 cups of flour, 5 cups of rye flour, half a cup of cornmeal, and then a tablespoon of salt, and half a cup of water, I believe. And
was it warm?
Was the
water?
The water? No.
It might have actually stunted it.
Really? Okay, that might have been part of my problem too.
Okay.
And then the ale barm, berm, which I guess, and from the video they said that it was actually ale yeast is essentially the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Ale berm, I said barm, I think it's berm, is pronounced berm.
Chaff and chafe.
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. We're not professionals. It's
no.
It's actually made during the fermentation process of making beer. Possibly, I'm sure it's any alcohol, but beer specifically, it comes or ales. It's like the second portion of the fermentation process. It's the foam that rises during the fermentation. They just scrape that off, and that is the ale berm.
And typically ales they are made from a glutinous kind of oh my God, what's it called? Thank you. A glutinous kind of plant. And that also helps to make the bubbles that will make it bigger to rise.
Right. Yeah, that's what the yeast helps make the bread rise.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's essentially what is on top of the, during the fermentation process. And so I found that since you could just use ale yeast, when I tried to make mine, I put my ale yeast in a cup of water and I put it on the stove, as the instructions said. And it said to get it to about 80 to 100 degrees, so not super hot, so I put it on low. And then it says to stir it slowly, not fast. And for whatever reason, it said after a while you should see bubbles to form.
Yeah, it should get frothy.
Yeah, that never happened for me. And I let it sit there for 30, 45 minutes, nothing happened. So I just poured it into my...
Are you sure
into my bread.
Where'd you get your yeast? Did you get fresh yeast?
Don't hate me. I got it on Amazon.
Hey, it could still be good.
It could still be good. Amazon does have some good things. I have no idea if it might have been old. I have no idea.
My first recipe that I tried to do earlier this week, I used yeast that I thought was totally fine. Come to find out, it expired in 2015, and I made a 3-pound doorstop.
I don't think that even occurred to me that yeast could expire, and I think I just poured it in.
I didn't think about it either.
Yeah, that's an easy thing that can miss on something like that.
Yeah.
It's a dry product. Like, why would you think like it would expire?
Right. And also, you're supposed to store it in the fridge. Apparently, once you open, I didn't know that one either.
Oh, I just put mine back in the pantry. I should probably go move it. Well, I'm probably not going to use it again. So that was our thing, our recipe, our food item this week.
Mm-hmm.
Mine, I don't think it turned out very well. It's still moist in the middle. I baked it for like I said, almost 2.5 hours, I think, and it would not bake all the way through. I don't know. It was like my whole process was a complete failure. I mean, it's still edible. Like, it's here. Like, I could eat it. I'll eat a little bit of it now, but it's not the way bread's supposed to be. And
mine turned out to be a bit of a thick biscuit kind of a texture. It's got some lamination and some holes.
That's a good,
but it's definitely not what I was expecting. It's not fluffy by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I expect there to be like air pockets and like regular bread is. And this is. So I actually weighed mine. Now, I don't think I told you this, but I actually made I had, because 5 cups of flour.
That's a lot of flour. Yeah.
So mine, it actually made 2 of these. It was one big one, and before I put it in the oven, I split it in 2.
Okay.
And I baked them both at the same time. And it's not a bad flavor. Like, it tastes okay.
Yep. Mine is cheesy.
Really?
Yeah,
mine's
I don't know. I don't know how I did that.
I don't know. Yeah, that's odd. McBread and it's cheesy flavored.
There's no cheese in here.
Yeah. Mine's kind of like it's probably the cornmeal that I'm tasting more than anything. So
Yeah.
More like cornbread is more the flavor that I'm getting. Just not quite as strong. Because again, there was originally 5 cups of flour mixed in with that. And I think part of the problem when I made this was that my cornmeal, why I think it didn't mix very well when I mixed it in with the flour, was because you have to cook the cornmeal first. You're not supposed to just put it in powder.
Really?
Yeah, my instructions specifically told me to put the half cup of cornmeal in with 2 cups of water, and then add salt to it, and then
make grits.
And then essentially make grits out of it. And then but I think you heat it up to a boil, and then you remove it from the heat, and you keep stirring it until it thickens up like grits, essentially.
Wild.
And I think I let it cool too long, because it was almost cold when I mixed it in. I think that might have been part of the problem why it didn't mix well. I think I waited just a little bit too long to put it in.
That
because
makes sense.
because when I put it in, it was still very chunky, and like you can kind of see little clumps of it here and there in the bread.
Well, that'll be fun to bite into.
That's what I'm saying. Like, yeah. It's very dense, and mine actually weighed 1.1 pounds. That's how dense it is, and this is maybe a 6-inch round loaf. I mean, it's probably not even. It's like a 5-inch round loaf. It's not a very big loaf. I mean, and it weighs 1.1 pounds. It's very dense, and it's not fluffy and light like bread's supposed to be. And so yeah, and it was super hard to cut with a bread knife. I was telling you earlier, like I was about to take it to my table saw. It was that hard to cut, and it finally cut okay. But like I said, the middle of it is still super dense. But it's supposed to be fairly close to an original recipe that would have been used in the 1600s, and I think 1500s too, because they didn't have access to fresh, clean water and things like that. So a lot of the bread that they ate, they had to boil their water, a lot.
Right.
So
you could scoop out the middle, like the innards of it, so that you don't have to worry about the squishy dense part.
Just eat the semi-moist stuff. Yeah.
You could, but then you have that big old bowl of bread. And
I could use it like a soup bowl.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
That'd be delicious.
Yeah. But so a lot of the bread that they made, back then was beer bread essentially, and
which is so yummy, but I can't have it.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I didn't really look into this part much. I don't know why they specifically used rye flour instead of like regular flour, like out of wheat. I think I did
because of the climate up there.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. I think I did briefly read something about it where it said wheat the rye lasts longer than the wheat does for like after harvesting.
Right, and remember you said that up there. I'm trying to see it. Wet springs. If wheat sits in water too long, it rots and you can't use it.
I think that's more or less what it was. So the rye would last longer.
Right.
But as we see here, there's a possible connection that the rye ergot, the rye fungus, could possibly have caused the witch trials too, because it's essentially LSD at that point, because it's LSD is extracted from the rye, from rye fungus. So anyway, so that's quick. This week's food item, and I actually had somewhat fun making it. I think I told you last night, I was going to try and make another one this morning or later last night. But after this one turned out somewhat okay, just a little, I decided not to.
It scared you away, didn't it?
I decided just to go with it, yeah. Well, so I found another recipe, though, that I was going to use.
Oh, yeah, you told me about that. And
I think this one was directly from, not a sponsor, Food Network. And
they got good stuff.
Yeah, and they had really good. It was a good recipe on there. It was made by a very flamboyant guy. It was fun. It was fun watching the video that he made.
That's awesome.
Funny. Yeah, and But yeah, so that is this week's meal item. Now, I know it's not as great as it would be if we had video and you guys could actually see these, but
yeah, someday maybe.
Yeah,
thoughts for the future.
It has been in discussion.
We have such plans.
Yeah, but for now, this is what you get. You get our banter about making things that we find relevant to the story.
The trial and error.
Yep. And the possible failures of our baking escapades.
For sure.
And other whatever else food items we make. And so I think I said this last week too. Like we are going to try and for the most part make the food items that we find.
Right.
I don't know if we actually said that before, or I don't know if we've actually talked about that, but I think that was kind of the thing that I thought would be the best about it was that we hand make everything. As to the best of our abilities anyways. Now some ingredients, in the future we just may not be able to get a hold of because they might be specific to certain parts of the world that we just can't get.
Yeah, location is a big issue. Yeah. I'm landlocked. I'm living in Kansas, so there's some stuff I'm not getting fresh.
Right. So that's, but we'll do what we can as far as we can. So.
Yep. Okay. Now that we've delved into the complexities of colonial cooking, let's try our hand at the historical context of the Salem Witch Trials, including the religious and political climate of the time and the beliefs about witchcraft that were prevalent in the community. We'll also examine the events leading up to the trials, including the accusations made against the accused and the methods used to extract confessions. Throughout the episode, we will explore the impact that the trials had on the community of Salem and how they continue to be remembered and studied today. Join us as we uncover the fascinating and tragic history of the Salem Witch Trials and gain a deeper understanding of the historical and cultural forces that shaped this dark chapter in American history.
These witch trials took place in Salem in the province of Massachusetts Bay between 1692 and 1693. Most people don't know that according to records, only 20 witches and 2 dogs apparently were actually killed during this period.
I thought it was so much more. Sorry.
So yeah, so most people, they do. A lot of people, they think, now as we're going to go into this, they'll say, there was actually hundreds of people that were accused.
Right.
But only 20 or so were actually here. They were hung, not burned at the stake. But
exactly.
Yeah, they were actually hung.
And here in the U.S., it was actually towards the tail end of the historical witch trials over in in Europe.
Right.
They had been doing it for centuries before, but ours came at the very tail end of the whole witch trial problem.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably because we had just I guess we were migrated over to our country, and then we were starting to build it, and so that's probably a large reason as to why it was the tail end.
Yeah.
Because we had not been here this was almost 200 years. So I guess that's quite a while, but I don't remember exactly when we started to actually migrate. I know Christopher Columbus supposedly, which he didn't discover America, he discovered Cuba, but it was 1492. So but I forget when exactly.
And he was Spanish.
Yeah, he was Spanish. So, but that's a good point. Yeah, a lot of people, our history books and stuff, they make it sound like there was a lot more.
Right.
That actively were hung and I believe a lot of our books said that they were burned at the stake, which is not true. They were hung. Most people don't know that according to records, only 20 witches and 2 dogs were actually killed during this period. So they also, and like I said, I didn't know this originally, that they were actually taken to the gallows hill to be hung instead of being burned at the stake, like the stories tell it. Now, I can't remember for the life of me what stories in our history books and stuff. Like I can't think,
it's been a hot minute.
History book. It's been a hot minute. Yeah.
They really didn't cover it very well. I remember thinking
they didn't cover very much, and I don't know if it was because the violence that was involved in it or whatever. I mean, we learn about all kinds of wars and whatever throughout history. I mean, there's always been war. But for this specifically, I don't remember, what stories in the books or in our history books. But yeah, I don't agree, or I agree. I do agree that it was like just breezed over real quick.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so only 19 of them were actually hung, and one of them was tortured to death. And now, again, granted that these stories have been passed down for over 300 years, and of course they have changed dramatically over that time. So there's no 100% proof way that we can say without a doubt, that this is exactly how it happened, because there's always some leeway in every story. And there's always someone willing to fudge records. Right, that too. Yeah, throughout history, there's always somebody that, could have, wrote a record to make it show a certain number or whatever. For all we know, I mean, the 100 or 200 people or whatever that were actually accused, I mean, a lot more of them could have actually been hung elsewhere and just not recorded. Right. So what we do know for sure for here is what is actually supposedly recorded history. Right. That's all that we can verify is what's actually recorded. Right. Here's another fun fact. Not all of the victims were women. I always believed they were for some reason, but in our day and age, I believe male witches are actually called warlocks or wizards. The warlock is designated for more sinister and dark practitioners, whereas wizards are considered to be more wise and helpful. Like Dumbledore. Yeah. Though it doesn't seem that played into the consideration during the trials. But how did they start? Well, we're going to tell you. It all started because a couple of girls were behaving rather odd for their time. Elizabeth Parris, age 9, daughter of Salem Village's first ordained minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, and his niece, Abigail Williams, age 11. It was said that they were having fits, throwing things, making strange sounds, and contorting themselves into strange positions. A local doctor said that they were bewitched. Another girl, Ann Putnam, Jr., which is odd because girls are usually junior. Oh, back then they totally were. Were they? Yeah, it was a big thing to have, to name your very firstborn daughter after the mother. I didn't know that they actually called them junior, though, is what I'm saying. Oh, yeah. That's weird. Yeah, I thought it was only the men that did that. Learn something new every day. Yes, you do. So she was age 12 and was reported to have similar fits. So when they were pressed by the local magistrates, Jonathan Corbin and John Hawthorne, the girls accused a local Caribbean slave by the name of Tituba, Sarah Good, a beggar woman, and Sarah Osborne, who was elderly and impoverished, as the perpetrators. Now, originally to me, I remember hearing these stories and thinking, this sounds like a bunch of bratty kids. Yeah. And who were obviously jealous of these women, or they'd done something to make the girls mad. Right. And they just wanted to stir up trouble and issues and get attention. There's also the possibility that there was something mentally wrong with them, like they were being slowly poisoned. For instance, since lead paint was used a lot back then, maybe they got some brain damage from that particular substance. Yeah. Or like you said earlier, perhaps it was from the LSD and the fungus from the rye bread. Right. Nevertheless, Tituba was arrested a few days after the girls were questioned and then suddenly confessed she was a witch, which probably translates into she was coerced into confessing to stop being abused or beaten or however she was being treated. Or maybe she really did think she was a witch, as witchcraft, voodoo, and hoodoo were quite prevalent in the Caribbean at that time. Or perhaps she had some kind of mental issue, as she confessed to seeing spectral shapes, black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a tall man with white hair who wanted her to sign his book. Which, to be fair, not all of those sound too strange to our ears now, but back then it was a little suspicious. Anyways, she confessed to being a witch, and then began to speak of other witches in Salem, which ended up causing the infamous massive witch hunt to find these said witches. This, of course, caused other issues where people began to take advantage of the situation, if we can even call it that. Other people began accusing neighbors and other family members that they simply didn't like just to get rid of them. An interesting fact about that is that the source of such animosity came from the King William's War, also known as the Indian War. It was waged on the North American colonists by the English monarchs William and Mary in their fight with France. It sent refugees into the Massachusetts Bay Area and pressed down the existing rivalry between the wealthy families that relied on the Salem port and simultaneously those that depended on agriculture. This, of course, did nothing but feed the inevitable fire that would become the American Revolution. Now, there are records that show numerous people were found not guilty, evaded arrest, or escaped jail. However, there were 4 people that did die while in jail, awaiting their trials. The exact number of people accused of witchcraft is unclear, but the number is believed to be above 200. Apparently, not everyone who was accused was even pursued by the authorities of that time.
We do have a small number of notable people that were found guilty and executed. Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susan Martin, Sarah Wilds, Reverend George Burroughs, and Elizabeth Johnson Jr. Bridget Bishop, who was the first person to be executed for witchcraft in Salem, was a tavern owner and a free spirit who had been married 3 times, which of course was considered a major no-no with those particular puritanical individuals. She was accused of witchcraft by several people in the community, including some of her own neighbors. She was found guilty and hanged on June 10, 1692. Another well-known victim of the Salem Witch Trials was Rebecca Nurse. Nurse was a respected member of the community and a devout Christian who had never been accused of any wrongdoing. However, she was accused of witchcraft by a group of teenage girls, and despite her protestations of innocence, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging as well.
One of the most tragic stories of the Salem Witch Trials is that of the Proctor family. John Proctor was a successful farmer and a vocal opponent of the trials. However, his wife, Elizabeth, was accused of witchcraft, along with several other members of the family. John tried to defend his wife and prove her innocence, but he was also accused of witchcraft and arrested. Elizabeth was pregnant at the time and gave birth to a child while in prison. Despite his efforts to clear his name, John was found guilty and hanged on August 19, 1692. Elizabeth was eventually released from prison, but her reputation was forever tarnished. Now, I just want to think about that. Now, this happens all the time now, still. Women having kids in prison. But back then...
It was major...
I'm surprised she didn't die in prison having that kid.
For sure. That's probably the only reason she got saved was because of that.
Yeah.
Because she was pregnant.
Women died at childbirth all the time then.
Mm-hmm.
Because, back then, I don't think back then...
No, I remember. The reason she actually lived was because there was a lady in there who... I can't remember which lady it was. One of the women who was in prison with her actually happened to be a midwife, and she helped her to give birth. That was the only reason her and the baby survived.
Oh, yeah.
I remember reading that.
Yeah. That's... Talk about luck.
Right. Sort of.
Maybe that's why there was a midwife then. Maybe it did happen more often than...
Oh, that was definitely one of the problems. Yeah.
We have, nurses and stuff now that, or doctors in prisons and stuff now.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they had back then too. I don't know. But I was gonna say, the main reason why I think a lot of women died and stuff, because for one, they had no idea what germs were.
Right.
They didn't know, they would go from one bloody victim to the next without washing their hands or anything. And that's why a lot of people died. And I can't remember. I've told you this before. A lot of times when I do my episodes, it goes in one ear, I read it, and then it goes out the other ear.
Uh-huh.
And then I forget a lot of the episodes. So I'm pretty sure that I did an episode. It wasn't about penicillin, I don't think, but that should be good. That would be a good episode to do, about how penicillin was invented.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was the discovery of germs that I did an episode on.
Oh, neat.
And it specifically talked about, I don't think it was pregnant women, but it might have been pregnant women also, which might be why I thought of it. But it was about how the guy that discovered germs realized that the reason why his victims were living, or his patients the majority of his patients were surviving, was because he was actually washing his hands between procedures.
Wow, that's crazy.
And so it was some kind of experiment that they did, where some doctors, a lot of people back then, you're like, oh, whatever, there's no microscopic, blah blah whatever.
Micro.
that whole concept was, benign to them, whatever,
Right.
And so they went through, and everybody hoped that they got the doctor where the patients lived the most.
Right.
Of course.
The one that has the bigger number of living patients.
Right. So everybody was always scared, I think, to get in that particular town, I think is what it was when they first, to get pregnant. I believe it was about pregnant women. And that they discovered that when they were doing these procedures, that he was actually washing his hands, and that's why his patients survived more of his patients survived. And that's how the discovery of germs came about. I believe I did an episode about that. If I didn't do an episode about it, we should absolutely do an episode about that, because it is a great story.
Heck yeah. Well, and then we can add on to it, too, the fact that up until I think it was like the 60s or the 70s, doctors still were like going, that's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. And then they started doing studies in cultures and stuff, and they were finding like the real hard evidence that, it kind of is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to... If I sound muffled now, it's because I put another piece of that crappy bread in my mouth.
It's there. It looks good. It's taunting you.
I know. I had a bunch of little broken up pieces, and I kept finding myself reaching over and grabbing it and eating it.
Despite the efforts to clear their names, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials continued to haunt the victims for centuries. In the early 20th century, a memorial was erected in Salem to honor the victims and remind people of the dangers of intolerance and persecution. In 2022, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., believed to be the last accused Salem witch sentenced to death, was formally exonerated by Massachusetts lawmakers. One of the most tragic aspects of the Salem Witch Trials is the impact it had on the lives of the accused and their families. Many of those accused of witchcraft were subjected to horrific treatment, including imprisonment, various torture, and the obvious execution.
Today, their story is remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of groupthink, hysteria, and the dangers of accusing others without evidence. It serves as a reminder that even in the most trying of times, we must always strive to uphold the principles of justice and fairness, and resist the urge to give in to fear and suspicion. As we conclude our discussion about the Salem Witch Trials, let us strive to learn from the mistakes of the past and to promote understanding, compassion, and justice in our own time. Thank you for listening to another episode, and I hope you'll join us again for the next episode.
Bye!
Thanks for listening to Smarticus Tells History. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review, and make sure to subscribe. And be sure to follow the show at facebook.com/Smarticus Tells History. Or just click the link in the show description. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.